everybody. This is our first consciousness dialogue for theorists and experimentalists between me. My name is Nao professor in Monash University, and Alex. Do you want to?
I'm Alex Meyer. I am associate professor at Vanderbilt University.
Okay, great. So this is supposed to be the dialogue between the theorists and the experimentalists, and I'm kind of representing a theorist side, and Alex is going to represent the experimentalist side, and we are going to talk about our personal kind of perspective on the consciousness research from this perspective. And before getting started, yeah, so please jump in whenever you want. The aim of this dialogue is following. We are primarily targeting the audience of younger generation, especially neuroscientists who want to study the mystery of consciousness. And we want to also facilitate the interdisciplinary research on consciousness. So we want to also provide the accessible entry to those people outside of the consciousness, but can be related. And then the reason why we wanted to start this is that because we don't find suitable media that does this kind of thing. So especially, we thought it would be interesting to give some kind of perspective or opinion from us, the mid-career researchers who became BI, explicitly stating that we are interested in consciousness, because this is the kind of the first generation, I think, in the world right now. And then we were also thinking of writing a blog or papers or potential book out of this series. And then topic-wise, we are going to talk about the various topics on consciousness research. Alex, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so just what you said, I think that this is an exciting time to join the field, and we hope that we can convey why we think that is, and maybe provide a little bit of context and a historical perspective for people that are new to the field. They might find some things confusing and go from maybe where we came from all the way to where we're now and where we're headed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so as a first episode, we thought that, as Alex said, our kind of biography may be the first thing we should actually talk about. So from this section, I'm going to serve as a host or interviewer for Alex, and want to ask Alex to sort of, past history, how you get into consciousness research. So this is a brief, CV for you on the left side, and then right side is me, and then we have some kind of interaction or sort of intersection of, there were several career, moments that we intersected quite a bit. So we wanted to discuss this. So maybe do you want to give a brief introduction or your self-history here?
Sure, happy to. So it all started for me as a high school student, and so there might be people in the audience that are also still quite early on, and so I'd like to encourage you, if that's the case. I started reading popular science books towards the end of high school. And so listed a few books here that were really quite influential on my thinking. So Richard Dawkins, obviously, with the selfish gene. I put a philosopher here who's more known within Germany, who basically provided a theory of philosophy that is grounded in evolution and biology. And so my thinking at the time shifted from being generally interested in psychology to a more biological basis of psychology. And that is when I encountered Francis Crick's book, An Astonishing Hypothesis. So in fact, it was the year when high school finished and I had to decide what to do next. And so I found this book and it has a more flashy title in German. In German, it's called "What the Soul Really Is," and it was from a Nobel laureate that I knew.
Yeah, is it the subtitle of the English version? Maybe.
The English version says "The Scientific Search for the Soul," so it's close.
Oh, yeah. I see.
And
Wow.
And really what the book does is it just provides an overview of visual neuroscience at that time. So that was the early to mid 1990s. So it really got me on fire. But nowadays, when I hand people the book and I expect the same, it usually falls flat. Most people don't find it as exciting as I thought back then.
Yeah, many people actually said that why this is astonishing, right? At least you know at this point right now. Yeah, but maybe back then it was astonishing, and yeah, maybe there are more astonishing hypotheses right now. So it may look pale.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah. I also
totally
read
agree.
Dawkins. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I also read Dawkins, but when I was in university, and also I read the Creek, but it was between my transition from university to graduate school. So you are quite mature as a high school student reading all these books, actually.
Well, I should say that Germany high school at the time was longer than it is in the rest of the world, and than it is now. So this would probably correspond to undergraduate in terms of US or even Germany these days.
I see. Did you read this all in English or German?
I read this all in German. And so it's only now that I actually got the English translation of the book. And I still find it striking because it ends with Crick saying that we should all put a poster up in our laboratories that says consciousness now. Yeah. And so it was a rallying cry that it's time to study that. Yeah. And what struck me the most, I'd be curious to hear, so it sounds like you were already sold on studying consciousness when you read the book. But what struck me when I read the book was the homunculus problem. Basically, I remember reading page by page about how vision starts in the retina and then what happens at each subsequent step. And I was waiting for the homunculus. I was waiting for the part of the brain where perception happens. And so as he stepped through the visual system, I realized that there is no homunculus. And it was only then when I understood the real problem of consciousness and the excitement of the possibility of studying it.
Yeah. It's not that easy. Unlike other types of the big mysteries, like, you know, the origin of the universe or origin of the life, the mystery of consciousness takes time to realize why this is interesting, right? Actually, and the more you learn about the brain and also consciousness, it starts to become more enigmatic, and the mystery actually deepens as you go deeper. And then at some point, many people kind of, you know, switch to something more tractable, and then that's the kind of sad, sort of the track record of many of the neuroscientists who became interested in this, you know, consciousness or neuroscience because of the consciousness, but in a sense drop out, and we are the kind of exception in a sense. Yeah.
Well, it is still a hard topic to get funded for. It still is certainly it is a topic that many people are interested in, that now is made it into the textbooks, but it's still it's early stages, and I think that's why it is exciting. So I hope that in these conversations we can go over a lot of the progress that has been made since those days of the earliest research. Yeah,
and maybe we can also talk about the funding issues at some point. But you know, it's hard to say really. My guess is that you know, as I'm talking to other people from different, you know, fields, like, you know, who are working on evolution or, you know, different kind of biological problems and so on. I'm not really sure whether the consciousness research is specifically more difficult than any other fields. You know, I want to see the hard data or evidence to, you know, effect really.
That's a really good point. Yeah, yeah. Funding is hard in general, so I agree with you. And it certainly is not impossible. So
no.
There are now almost specific funding sources for consciousness research. So yeah, I agree with you that it may actually be a difference to what things were like in the 1990s.
Yeah. And in fact, in that sense, when I'll jump a little bit. My advisor, Christoph Koch, he was jokingly saying in the lab meeting that he's now writing a grant and so on. And then at some point, I remember either I or somebody else asked that, what is that grant about? And then he was saying something like, attention, awareness. And then we asked, why not consciousness? And then he said that, oh, that's impossible. If you use a C word in the grant, then you'll be dead, at that time when I was a grad student between 2000 and 2005. But now, last year we got this, grant called Qualia Structure. And that's even more radical in the sense that we, put the qualia as a title. But, that's the current, movement, I would say. All right, so
yeah, maybe we can talk a little more about. I wanna hear about your background and what got you in the field as well. But then later we can maybe talk about what's in the middle between our timelines here, because I feel that you were one of the people who basically blazed the trail there, together with our mentors and the senior generation that inspired us. But what's shown right here is that I remember at some point you telling me that your plan was to have a symposium about consciousness at every major neuroscientific conference. And that was probably maybe even with the graduate students, and I thought that was absolutely impossible, but then you did it. And so basically many of the things that are listed here came into fruition. And so I remember how that all culminated, including the biggest, the Society for Neuroscience conference.
Yeah, exactly. I now remember that. So I'll add this here. In fact,
so what got you into consciousness? So you have, instead of books, you already have like really big names at the top. So I'm curious.
Yeah, so to explain that, maybe I need to go a little bit before this. My first kind of encounter to the consciousness problem was the encounter of the death of my dearest friend when I was before entering to elementary school. And then there, talks about, death and the after death kind of soul stuff didn't make sense to me. And then that was the kind of initial spark. And then I also talked with my friend, discussed or argued whether it's possible to, prove if my green or my blue is the same or different from your blue or green. And then we discussed quite a long time, but didn't come to the conclusion at that time, right? And that was a junior high school. But around that time, I was mostly occupied with mathematics and also physics mostly. But I already at that time had an idea that I wanted to be a scientist, more or less. And my choice was which field it was. And the math, physics are difficult. So I more or less, kind of gave up or wasn't super interested in pursuing this, but earth science or brain is in general more promising, more closer to Nobel laureates because it's not, done a lot, right? And then when during the Kyoto University, I learned mostly math, physics, and so on. And then the last year of this university, I joined the lab who studies cerebellum because that was the only lab which did the brain science at the time. And it was quite initially interesting, but the more I learned cerebellum, it became kind of less interesting. And I didn't know exactly why, because it did the function and it did gets involved in some kind of language and so on, but it never excited me at all, right? And then towards the end of my undergraduate, I had a symposium held in Japan, Okazaki. And there, these people like Rosetis Shao and also Mansell Lame and Shimojo and so on was invited as a guest speaker. And Ryota Kanai and I was in the same lab on the same year. And we were discussing that, oh, maybe we should actually go there. But before going there, we should read each of these papers that they have as a representative thing to understand better what they are doing. And then we did the two-person journal club in English as a two poor Japanese student. But we went through these papers. And these 4 papers were quite life-changing, actually. And around that time, I decided to study something like, binocular rivalry or decision making or attention or something like that. And that was all done in monkeys right here. So I really was interested in doing it, but every time I talk to the people, monkey physiology is super difficult and time consuming. So I wasn't super sure whether I want to do that. But then I applied a lot of grad school in US and then I got rejected by all of them. And then still I kind of, went to US and then, did the volunteer work with Christoph, and then Christoph liked me and then got into Caltech. That was my kind of dark side of my history, but, I joined the Caltech here. And then to briefly get to your question about, how I came to, the idea of having major symposia in major conference. I don't know whether I had that vision when I met you at the first time in ASSC in Pasadena, right? I think it was
2005.
Around, 2004 or 5. And but ASSC at that time was probably like 4th or 5th edition.
Yes, I think it was the that's right, the 5th maybe, yeah.
Maybe 8th or so. Because I remember that I went to Belgian ASSC with Ryota in 2000 or something like that. So something around that. But anyway, Christoph was around that time maybe complaining that he thought that consciousness research should grow much faster, but it's always confined within this 200, 300 kind of meeting, and that's partly because how the ASST is organized. But anyway, I thought that to involve more serious people, we need to do symposium across different kind of conference, and that's we ended up in doing with SFN and also Cosine and other places as well when we were postdoc, right? Probably. We tried a lot.
Vision. Vision as well. They all worked. That's right. That's really interesting. And so so we met in 2005, and I remember it was I had in the meantime I had joined the Logothetis lab. And that's because it almost gets mentioned it does get mentioned, I think, in a later edition of Francis Crick's book.
Yes, exactly.
Because he talks about the rivalry research, and so I realized there's a laboratory in Germany that does that. But I should give credit to my girlfriend at the time, Melanie Wilke, who she was the one giving the final push. So I met her studying at the University of Munich, and she was the one that said, let's just write an email to Nikos Logothetis after we saw our talk. And we did, and then we ended up doing our PhD there. And in 2005, we went to Pasadena, and I remember you coming and telling us that you had just discovered this new thing called continuous stretch suppression. So it was brand new back then. Very exciting, and being able to suppress things with binocular rivalry for almost infinitely, it seemed. And so that was my first impression of you. That you said, "I discovered this cool new thing. Can I show it to you in the lab?"
So that's right. So in ASSC in Pasadena, that was actually quite an interesting time, right? Because I think it was Hakwan who got the James Prize, and he gave a talk around that time. And I was also quite impressed by the fact that you and Melanie, as a still almost like graduate student, right, at that time.
Right.
And you had Nature Neuroscience paper with Leopold, and had them tutorial, which we need to pay extra, to do to attend. And then I attended your tutorial, I think, partly because around that time I think my CFS continuous flash suppression paper was under the review, and I wanted to claim that this is really brand new, and also very robust and so on. But Melanie, it was Melanie's paper or David's paper, the general flash suppression.
Yes.
Was also published 1 year or two before, and so
I
wanted to check out all the other suppression technique around the time, and then wanted to see whether you guys had anything like continuous flash suppression to check it. As a grad student, I was kind of panicking every time any kind of new suppression technique is published, and then see whether that was going to compete with mine and so on. Yeah.
Right. And I remember that hanging out at night and together with Olivia Carter and Joel Pearson and Ryota, and so it seems that we immediately connected. It was like a group of graduate students basically that among kind of the first graduate students that kind of really wanted to do this consciousness stuff. And so, it's exciting to think back how far we've come.
Yeah, so we should probably, be careful that not to forget, same generation kind of people we met over there. But as you said, all the people you mentioned now, remained in academia and also, got a PI position, and everybody became like, independent and so on. And so that was the time when I think the keynote talk was also Stan Dehaene and also Giulio Tononi, right? Both of them independently talked about global workspace theory, and also Giulio talking about integrated information for the first time, I think. And I remember I asked a lot of questions to him, Giulio, about cerebellum at the end of his talk, actually. So it was nascent time that predicted, in a sense, the current time, but also around that time, it was, in a sense, the time when many people were really focused on finding the neural correlates of consciousness, right? Without much doubt that, this is going to, have a problem or, in passe in the,
yes, I think that
in the future.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And so, of course, the people that really get the credit for setting up the field are the people, as I said at the outset, the people that have Christoph and Francis and Nikos, Jeff, all the people that I mentioned at the top. The reason that I haven't talked so much about them yet is because I look so much up to these people, of course, and at that time, that is exactly how I remember things. And I think that's a great point to talk about. That what excited me was that there seemed to be a tangible neuroscientific research program. So yes, there was a lot of talk about the philosophy of consciousness. I remember Daniel Dennett, I think, was also in Pasadena. And as you said at the outset, it can be really hard to grasp what the problem really is about consciousness and the brain. And so David Chalmers around that time had started talking about the heart problem. There were the Churchlands, many other philosophers, Daniel Dennett getting into this. So at the same time in neuroscience and philosophy, things were budding. But what excited me the most was this idea that we can actually do this. And so that is basically the idea of Christoph Koch and Francis Crick with the neurocorrelates of consciousness. And to some degree, a lot of that at the time was work on binocular rivalry. And related ambiguous stimuli, but there was also the parallel program of choice probability, and looking at basically the same, in effect, stimuli that are physically identical but might lead to different perceptual outcomes, and then go into the brain and try to find the neurons or areas or structures or processes that correlate with the perceptual outcome. And that just struck me as a genius move, that rather than just discussing how can we solve this problem, there was a program, and by the time that I joined graduate school, most of this work had already been done. So people had studied these things on multiple levels, including the level of single neurons. And so it seems to me almost that we joined almost at the tail end of that era, where people made these breakthrough discoveries and really papers that are now in the textbooks. The first really big step into the neuroscience of consciousness. Yeah, I'm one of the people who is still fired up about that. I still think this is a promising approach that I hope to keep doing.
Yeah, so in this respect, it was also the time that not only the single neuron type experiment was booming, but also lots of fMRI study was coming in, right? So around that time, I remember that, yeah, I really wanted to do fMRI, and yeah, because, every week pretty much, Nature Science features very nice, interesting, imaging experiment, and finding some kind of a high level cognitive, stuff, neural correlates of that. And that itself was already exciting. But at the same time, I also felt, well, maybe, just to going back to what you said, this, identical stimulus and different perceived paradigm. We are going to this kind of digression quite a bit, as long as we feel like, this is relevant for current consciousness research. One of the things that I wanted to discuss today is that, this initial encounter to one of these paradigms probably also shapes your, view of the consciousness research later on, right? So what you said is, binocular rivalry, and another one that is also popular is masking, backward masking, attentional blink. And my feeling is that people who study rivalry is in a sense, observing this phenomena for a long time by yourself, and then think about, what is this thing, for a long time. And one thing that becomes very clear or almost necessary to understand or accept is that, each moment you are conscious of something, right? And it probably put the idea of the consciousness is defined or experienced at each moment, right? On the other hand, backward masking, people tend to focus on what is presented at the time of the stimulus onset and then reported afterwards after trial. And this is my kind of, gut feeling, but those people tend to think that, consciousness emerge only at the time when the stimulus is processed and then get reported. And before and after, they don't tend to, focus on or appreciate what's going on. So
that's interesting. Yeah. Now that you mention it, there seems to be, you're right, that in terms of the different theories that are out there and people that maybe sympathize with one theory of consciousness more than the other, there seems to be a relationship with the paradigms that get used to study that. Now that you say it, you're right. It strikes me that people that study masking, that they might be more drawn maybe to some theories, and that the binocular rivalry maybe people that went that camp, if you will, got into a different direction. So that's a really interesting observation. I never thought about that. Yeah. So that's that's something to keep an eye out. That if you approach a question of consciousness maybe just from one angle, that it might shape your thinking about it more than one would immediately think.
Yeah.
that's a great point.
Yeah, so that also is probably true. As I'm, telling to you, it came to me that the sleep or dream or anesthesia, brain injury, this kind of,
Mm.
manipulation of a level of consciousness, these are
Mm.
also, that if you study from here, then that will also shape your, theory in the future. But I think these people also tend to probably think about consciousness as a state, right? At each
Mm-hmm.
moment we
Mm-hmm.
have something or not or whatever, rather than the result of one particular process generating this particular report, and then associate the report and consciousness very tightly. Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah, and
implying that. Yeah.
yeah, and the other thing is that with these paradigms, there comes immediately different kinds of analyses, right? So if you are, for example, in your case of masking, you have very clear trigger points that you, in time, that you align your data to. And so that immediately lends itself to different kinds of analyses than maybe something that is more ongoing, like a state. So in Binocular Rivalry, there's a trigger point as well that could be, for example, the switches that happen between the eyes. But there is the problem that you typically use some kind of behavioral indicator when the switch happens, and that comes with a natural noisiness in terms of when the actual perceptual state would have happened. So you don't have as clear of a trigger point. I mean, that is one of the reasons why flash suppression became maybe more popular at a later point, but that is also really important to keep in mind. And then, of course, what kind of technique you use in terms of studying the brain mechanism, whether it's EEG versus fMRI, for example, then those come also with different approaches, especially when it comes to time locking things, or looking at time. So yeah, I agree with that. It's very interesting to think about that might have shaped the early thinking in terms of being really so engaged with one of these paradigms.
Yeah.
I think it's also safe to say that rivalry probably has lost a little bit of favor in the consciousness field. I think that it was quite dominating at the time, and then there was maybe a series of papers, maybe even showing some critiques or criticisms, and so I don't see as much as back then, as you said, when there was almost like paper after paper after paper, and so. It's also interesting maybe to think about why. I mean, what some of your work on No report comes into play there, but it's interesting to think about in general about the relationship between the paradigms that we use to study consciousness and then our thinking about the brain and consciousness.
Yeah, so I think inherently the binocular rivalry is actually more closer to the mystery of consciousness than the backward masking and so on. Precisely because it's also difficult and so reveals many interesting aspects of consciousness, right? One thing that so jumping to current jumping around the current thing, one of the things that we are claiming right now through this qualia structure grant, and also another thing is that maybe the fixation of the paradigm that which was very popular around 2005 until now, which uses this identical stimulus and a different percept thing, is just really poor way of characterizing conscious experience in any way. Like it is in a sense okay to categorize backward mask stimulus as either seen or unseen, but unseen is actually complicated in a sense, right? Unseen, but seeing mask, for example, or seeing the background scene, and this is all completely smeared out or made it to the background, but we are actually seeing something in an unseen condition. But to make the analysis possible, we are just making it this unseen versus unseen kind of categorization. In the binocular rivalry case, if you experience it by yourself, then it becomes immediately clear that there is not only one percept or the other, but there is this transition thing. So at least,
Mm-hmm.
this imbues the idea that the consciousness is never binary, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And we are operationalizing this thing, in binary way. And, if you step back even a little bit back from that, this means that, conscious experience of one time is never like, one or the other, seeing or experience or not. It is experiencing something out of many, which leads to my affiliation to, or sort of support for the IIT type of ideas. But this is quite, important to, realize, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I agree with you. I think that rivalry, it was helpful in, again, educating people about what the problem is and that there is a scientific way at getting it, because it is such a striking demonstration. And I guess when it comes to masking, for example, if you do a demonstration of masking, well, you didn't see anything, so you don't have that striking experience that you have in rivalry. That that there's something in the other eye. You can always convince yourself, and yet you don't see it. And so I think it had a educational value in some sense. But I agree with you that I think what happened a little bit is that this paradigm, identical stimulus, different percept, it hit a wall in a way that the low-hanging fruit soon were gone. So both with fMRI and with looking at single neurons, people just stepped through the brain and were basically asking, so where are the neurons, where are the parts of the brain that make a difference when the perception changes? And so that became done after a while. And then the question was how to go on. And as you said, I think the field then shifted into studying the phenomena a little bit more closely and seeing that, well, things are not quite as simple and clear cut. And so what I would throw in there as well is also the research that you and Christoph have done about the role of attention and how that relates into all of that. Other people, I think they got drawn onto, as you said, the role of deciding on what your percept was actually in cases where there might be something not quite, and so you get in this twilight zone. And so things shifted more in the direction of decision-making, choice, behavior, and access, questions about not so much the phenomenology of consciousness, but more about what happens afterwards and what are we actually measuring here. And so I agree with you that I think the exciting, I think what you and I agree, the exciting step that is going on that I see in your current work is to almost leave all of this, put all of this aside and take an entirely new approach by taking a big, bold step away from these old paradigms and this old way of thinking towards looking at the structure of consciousness itself and resting it on the theory, the mathematical theories like integration, information theories that have arisen since. So that is, I think, a reason why this is very exciting, because I think people that might have witnessed the field and have thought that maybe things got a little stale or have the low-hanging fruit are gone. I think it basically, I hope, I want people to know that there's a new, interesting approach that gets around a lot of these problems that these old paradigms had. This having said, I still believe in this. Identical stimulus, different percept is still something that I think, in my mind, hasn't been. I still think it's a fruitful avenue as well. But I'm more excited about the new direction.
Yes, definitely. This identical stimulus, different percept is definitely the way to realize that it's not the relationship that we are interested. It's not the relationship between the external stimulus to the brain response that we are interested in. Rather, brain response to phenomenology, right? Because stimulus in this case is fixed, and then the brain response is different, and that results in the different percept. So fixing this is definitely an important component. But still, we what we are kind of proposing right now is to expand this stimulus set, and then also different kind of the percept or identical stimulus using many stimulus, and also allowing people to also describe the percept more in a richer way. So that's the new way of thinking about this, I think. And then also,
what I find so good. What I find exciting about this, what struck me when I realized where these things are headed, is that the reason that the old approach, identical stimulus, different percept, initially worked so well was that the analytical and mathematical tools were already in place. So a lot of work in neuroscience and in psychology in particular, in psychophysics, was perfectly made for this situation of two alternative first choice. So the mathematics was there, receiver operating characteristics, all these things that people started using at that point that was fascinating, interesting, but it also limits you to what psychophysics does, which is it limits you to looking at differences, and it negates, as you said, the fullness of conscious experience. And it especially negates that there is something that will be studied, like structure. So it immediately just focuses in on this very tiny, is there a difference or not? And so I think that's true for both masking, rivalry, all of these paradigms. And so moving away from that and doing and opening it up and saying, we're going to look at the structure of the perceptual experience is extremely exciting to me, but especially since it seems that now you and others are developing mathematical tools that make that possible. So it's again a situation where there's like a big philosophical idea, but also concrete quantitative techniques that can be used from an experimentalist side to get at that in terms of neuroscientific data.
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, that's what we want to do. Thank you. And this, structural analysis is in fact really new, and we are doing like similarity matrix approach and so on. And then one thing we immediately kind of noticed was that, for example, similarity rating is not really married with the consciousness research actually, and precisely because we have the problem of this thing, identical stimulus, different percept. So, for example, when we show red patch, and then later on we also show red patch, and then we ask the similarity rating of the between two. Then, from our point of view, it's totally reasonable to say, expect that not all the subjects, not all the trials, subjects rate it as most similar, rating of 0. There is some kind of fluctuation, maybe because of the mood, attention, or no fluctuation in the brain in the end, that makes it less similar, right? Even though it's presented in a different location, no adaptation, And many studies in the similarity rating in the past regarded this as pure noise, because the previous analysis demanded that similarity rating to be treated as a distance. And the distance of A to A has to be 0. But if you think about it, it's already weird from a consciousness research point of view. Things presented at time 0, and also location, A, all right, and same physical stimulus presented at time T2, and on the left side, it doesn't necessarily need to be experienced as similar. So, we can't use the kind of the similarity analysis that we can use for the neural activity or stimulus level, similarity, where we can operationally, define the similarity between A and A has to be 0. So that's one of the theoretical paper that we are trying to write right now. But even that level of the basic thing is not really ready there. So I think, development around that method is one important, things. But also, with this type of the new analysis method, I think binocular rivalry is going to be, again, arisen as a highly promising tool to study consciousness, because it is, with the new methods to look at this, I think it's a very interesting phenomena to see, even though it's very difficult to control from the viewpoint of the signal detection or, one stimulus, one response type paradigm.
Yeah, this is all very fascinating. I think, as you said, since this is such a new idea to study the structure of conscious experience, it's basically the work that had already been done when the neurocorrelate of consciousness work started, which was basically resting on psychophysics and signal detection theory, other mathematical theories are already around. Basically, that has to now been done and started.
Yeah.
And I think it from my perspective, learning about these things in hindsight, it took so long just to develop these tools of psychophysics, because there's this natural tendency, or there was this historical tendency, to not take conscious experience seriously, or not see it as part of science, or take it outside of science. So what psychophysics managed to take it seriously, to show that there are tools analytically, mathematically to measure it, and then to show that you can study perception very precisely, and it follows mathematical rules. That was already such a breakthrough that I think what happened is that things then get kind of stuck a little bit at just measuring differences. Just, is there a difference, yes or no? And we got very good at that, computing D prime and things like that. But yeah, as we said before, maybe in order to break out of the old paradigm, a complete shift is needed, and to appreciate that consciousness is more than just differences, and that there's this other thing that we all know exists, but to get at that mathematically and then hopefully eventually neuronally, I think it's exciting, just because each time we take a step to something new, there's low-hanging fruit, there's things that will get learned very quickly. So this is why I think this is a very exciting time.
Yeah, so it's it's kind of interesting, even for us, relatively young, researchers, to going back over the last 15 years, we already kind of learned what has been happening, right? So every time, as you said, new method is invented, there is a surge of, low-hanging fruit, as you said, like decoding was one thing at that time, and the fMRI, of course, resolution, higher resolution, or similarity analysis, and also, choice probability was also the thing like that, right? So it's basically showing some kind of random stimulus and then force people to choose A or B. And then you try to find a neuron that correlates with this decision. And I just wanted to talk about this choice probability thing a little bit. So the most, influential work was probably Bill Newsom and the colleagues, right? Also, or Mike Shadlen. And I was actually quite, influenced by, probably it was either you or Ryota's remark that when you show random dots of 0% coherence, and then ask people or monkeys to categorize it either left or right, it's completely ridiculous, because what you are seeing is something like random, but you have to say that it was left or right. So if you are allowed to say, or you're allowed to choose, the option of, what I saw was random, everybody should actually press that button, but you are forced to say left or right. And that may be interesting from a decision-making point of view, but how relevant is it for understanding consciousness is totally unclear, right?
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot to say about that. So I think that the term perceptual decision kind of showed that there was perception in it, because the decision had to be make a perception, but in the end, the focus was on the decision. And that it was a forced decision. And so I think it was exciting to see that if you force the animal to make a decision, that you can see, you can basically predict the decision by listening to the neuronal activity to a certain degree. But so the original work with Newsom, Shadlen, Mofshon, Britton, Cumming, and others that focused on area and T, which we know more now than back then, but it was exciting to see that there was this activity that correlated with the choice of the animal, and does allow, it's like mind reading. It allows you to predict what the animal's outcome is. But then studies using ambiguous stimuli, so structure for motion was the stimulus that was chosen for that. By Andrew Parker and Christine Krug, for example. And so they, many people have seen that this the rotating silhouette dancer, or in this case, a rotating cylinder or rotating sphere. Richard Anderson has done some work on that as well. So when that stimulus was analyzed using the same paradigm, so choice probability, the values were much higher. And so I remember basically the debate at the time, or the resolution of the debate was, yes, that's not surprising, because if you look, as you said, if you look at the random dot stimulus, there's hardly any difference. But if you look at that rotating cylinder, the rotating sphere, it's very striking. You see it this way or that way. And so, so there was an appreciation, I think, at least when that work came out, that that when it comes to choice probability, that there's an overlap between what might be perceptual and what is the choice. And I feel that field then drifted also towards the latter. So the early sensory cortex soon became less interesting in terms of finding where decisions are happening, and so people ventured out into the parietal and the frontal lobes, and so that the perceptual, the phenomenal aspect became secondary, if at all. And so it became much more about the behavior again, and less about the conscious percept. So that's my biased perception of and recollection of what happened back then.
Yeah, I do understand that, that kind of trajectory of the history, but I think all of these are probably worth revisiting with current technique, like what you're doing with neuropixels, and also analysis with more state-based, more moment-by-moment based kind of analysis, or correlation with phenomenology using, for example, IIT or any other theories. Even within MT, your influential work on MT neurophysiology around 2007 PNAS kind of showed that MT is not really promising to explain the NCC, in the sense that Crick and also Christoph proposed, right? But all of this is based on the assumption that there is a small population of neurons whose activity level directly correlates with the conscious experience. But if you start to think about sort of causal influence patterns or information structures that emerge from these are the ones that are actually relevant, revisiting this question in MT and then recording from a population of neurons and then to reconstruct this structure, maybe necessary to explain this phenomenology of the binocular rivalry between the moving stimuli.
Yes, I agree, and thanks for calling the paper influential. It's very flattering. I think it only has 14 citations, but yeah, I agree with you that yeah. But I think that I have the same hunch that now, back then, people were forced to record a single neuron at a time, and it was very hard work. And then a lot of the analysis got criticized because things had to be averaged a lot. So questions arose: why are there some neurons that you predict the percept perfectly, that have a choice probability of 1? How can that be? That led to a different kind of direction of research on noise and the role of noise in the brain. But also the averaging over time was the norm at the time. So very long periods of time that go way longer than the perception takes, or even the decision takes. And so now that we have the possibility to look at many hundreds of neurons at the same time, and we also have the machine learning tools on the decoding side to look at the information that is in there, and also that we learned about more than just spike rates, that we learned to look at the level of noise and synchrony and other things that neurons can do, and that all of these might be candidates for what we're looking for, rather than just being focused on what type of neuron might be correlated with perception, what type of process might be correlated with perception. I couldn't agree more. And the nice thing about the classic random dot kinematic REM paradigm that leads to choice probability is that it is beautiful that you don't just have this yes or no, binary, conscious or unconscious state, that you can fit an entire function. It's a parametric paradigm. You can do mathematically much more than just looking at this this simple paradigm by getting a neurometric function. If you correlate to a psychometric function, it is the dream that Fechner had about finding the link between the body and the mind in a mathematical sense. And so, yes, I think that I totally agree with you. That should be totally revisited. Maybe also throwing in the new causal techniques that we have in terms of optogenetics and other tools, so we can look at certain types of neurons and their role in some of these processes. So yes, that's why I also think these old paradigms, there should be anything but in the closet. We should keep doing this work on them using these new techniques.
Yeah, in terms of maybe. This may be the good time to probably close the relatively long, first session of the, this introduction, because we haven't actually gone through even after 2010.
We're too passionate about this. We're too passionate.
This is actually, totally. This is totally what I predicted in my mind, actually. But maybe to end with today's first session with. Problem of the previous studies, or the reason why we expect that future studies are so promising, right?
Yes.
Consciousness research. Yeah, so I think it's, in a sense, it's pretty, compared to previous era, it's easier in a sense to claim or ask for the grants, because there are so many things that we can do and so many things we have to do. Not only like technology of the recording from neurons, fMRI, or even fMRI, all the stuff can be redone by 70s newest fMRI, or also big data is also one thing that I think requires really interesting kind of analysis. Like, I'm not sure whether there's such a thing exists for the huge data sets of the binocular rivalry, or simultaneous recording of either EEG or even fMRI, right? If they are all shared and revisited with a different kind of analysis technique, that's already something very interesting. And all of them comes possibly with a machine learning technique on one hand, not to just do the simple decoding type analysis, but also try to identify the structure of the or relationship between all these percept or neural activity. That's all going to be very interesting. And also the interference technique like optogenetics, or a recent technique about lift up, low frequency, low intensity frequency ultrasound pulsation.
Oh, so that's to activate?
Both activation
locally
and also,
activate?
activation and suppression.
So the colleagues of mine at Vanderbilt are working on that. So it's very exciting. Yeah, so non-invasive.
Yeah, non-invasive and so quite a focal, right? It seems.
Yeah, and the next step is to, for example, cage neurotransmitters or neuromodulators and then uncage them. There's dread. There's so many new techniques on the causal side as well that are truly exciting. And I agree with you.
What you're talking about is the monkey technique, right? The caging and uncaging, not human.
That's right. So I think most invasive techniques are still animal models. I agree. So that's exciting about the ultrasound, that you can very precisely target something deep inside the brain in humans as well.
Yeah, in humans. That's why I thought that interesting.
I agree. But there's of course also increasingly push towards doing neurophysiology in humans. So deep brain stimulation is so common, is everywhere these days. And then it's astonishing how when Elon Musk stepped on the scene with his company, that they basically already have FDA FDA approval, how fast they move. And so their goal is definitely to put this in humans. So yeah, there's more to come. And they explicitly have this goal of reading out and writing, right? So they said that they want to have stimulation as part of their package right away. So there's more to come. And the big data, I agree with you, that will be the next frontier on the neuroscience side. Because with these neuropixels probes, we're talking terabytes upon terabytes. And there's great first approaches in terms of doing what you said, that the data sharing, to try to find a common format. So there's neuro data without borders, I think it's one of these approaches called that. People at the Allen Institute and the neuropixels people like Karen Dini Harris, Nick Steinmetz, people in Christoph's Institute are doing. So that's right. I think that the future may be that there will be people that are more on the experimental side and people on the experiment on the analysis side, because doing everything will become too overwhelming. We might soon be at the point that there's more data than people that can analyze it.
So that's very nice concluding remark for first session, because this is precisely what we want to achieve through this discussion, right? And so okay, with that probably we'll close for the first session, and then we'll come back again, maybe coming back starting from this electrophysiology in humans, because I know that you are pretty excited about the Elon Musk, and I also need to learn what he's doing a bit, and then also I can start talking about my experience with as a postdoc, where I started to analyze ECOG in humans. Okay.
Perfect.
All right. See you next time.
All right.
We'll just stop here.
Great.
In terms of recording.